Delft Observation Tower, which is a circular timber structure which is designed by me together with Edmund. And just a short presentation of us. That's me on the right there. My name is Ludvig, and I'm currently doing my master's thesis in architecture at Lund University in Sweden. And I'm also from Sweden, which could be worth mentioning.
Hello, I'm Edmund. That's me on the left. I am from the UK, but studying my master's here at TU Delft.
Yes, and this project came to be by this image on the left-hand side here, which was texted to me via WhatsApp from Edmund, wondering if we should do a competition together. It was a competition organized by Cellulose, which is a student organization at TU Delft, together with the Delft municipality to design an observation tower, which had to be 4 by 4 meters in footprint, a maximum of 10 meters in height, and with a focus on circularity, sustainability, and reuse of materials. And it was supposed to be part of this new development area in Delft called New Delft. And you can see the yellow arrow here on the screen indicates where the site is. So this was supposed to be a watchtower looking over this new development area, kind of letting the inhabitants of Delft be part of the new developments. And a more closer look on the site indicates that it has a very large nearby road and also a canal stretching right by it, but it's quite a small lot. And it's it was inhabited and still is by this restaurant, which is composed of reused building materials, windows and such. And it has a very clear focus on sustainability and eco-friendly thinking. They grow their own food and they have sort of this minimal waste mindset. So we kind of wanted to latch on to that way of thinking and that ethos of this project, and also kind of mimic that aesthetic to make our tower fit into this site nicely. We came up with a challenge in this project where we asked ourselves how we can make a timber structure fully circular, and how can we also design this structure to be completely constructed without professionals. Because it was part of the design brief that the budget was quite limited, which meant that we couldn't use any heavy machinery, any cranes, so it basically had to be built by volunteers. And to make a 10-meter structure, of course, that's a challenge in itself. And we found some inspiration in this project by Bureau SLA and Arup, which was made for the Dutch Design Week in 2017, where they made this pavilion which could be completely disassembled and reused after the Design Week. And they used these straps to keep the timber together, and we thought that was a very interesting idea. But of course, in this project, they only used it as a superstructure raised above the people using it. And we wanted to kind of take this concept further and actually make it possible to use the timber structure itself. So we came up with this very simple construction principle where we basically sandwich vertical timber pieces together and sandwich them together with steel straps. And this enables us to kind of wedge a horizontal joist in there and fully lock it in using only friction, no bolts, no screws, no glue, nothing. And of course, then if you cut the straps off, you can just reuse the material. And we found some steel straps to use, which are commonly used in the logistics industry to pack like big pallets of goods. And these steel straps are about 0.5 millimeter thick, and they can withstand quite some force. So it suited our project very well. And it also meant that we had to use these tools on the left-hand side, which is a tool specifically formed for this steel strap. And usually it's used as in the left-hand image here. You use it in a very controlled environment, an indoor warehouse or something, just to tie things together. And a big challenge we had then was that a building is, of course, not in a controlled environment. It's outside, there's weather, it's not on a horizontal surface all the time. So part of the challenge was also to figure out how to use this tool in the most efficient way. And our competition submission kind of was based on building this tower that could be used as its own scaffold. So if we could build it in parts going upwards, that would reduce both the total weight of the parts that our volunteers would have to handle, but also we could climb up the stairs as we built the tower. That was kind of our basic idea. And our final proposal for the competition looked like this, where in the visualization image, we kind of try to have this very playful aesthetic that we found in this restaurant on site. And we also found a concept here where we divided the tower in two parts, which you can see on the section to the right, where you have one very closed part, which is the staircase, which is this very internal experience of climbing a solid timber structure. And you have this open half facing the other way, where you can walk through the structure and kind of just use it as a pathway. And then, of course, as you climb the stairs, you also eventually reach the top observation deck, where you get a 360-degree view of Delft and the developments. And of course, after this stage, there was a lot of just admin, just finding different companies to work with, managing the budget and the time. But we'll spare you the details of that and just jump straight into construction, which started with a very hands-on approach on how to deal with the site. We didn't really have any fancy tools at hand, so just to mark out where the foundation were to go, we used wooden stakes, string, and tape measure, which worked quite well. We achieved quite high accuracy, but we kind of had to figure it out as we went along, making diagonals and making sure everything was a perfect square. And after we marked out these positions, we started installing the foundations. And as foundations, we used these screw piles, which is basically just a 3-meter long screw, which you screw into the ground, and then it can both support the weight of the structure, but it also keeps it from being pulled out of the ground by the strong Dutch winds. And a very neat thing about these foundations is that once the timber structure is not used anymore, since this is a temporary building, you can just take it apart and you can take these screws out and they can be reused as new. And to support our foundation beams, we had to dig trenches. And once again, this was a very hands-on thing, very rudimentary and very low tech. We dug everything by hand using shovels and spades. And of course, the soil was quite malleable and quite soft, but it's still hard labor to dig trenches around these screw piles, of course, which we became very aware of. And in the other end of the site, we set up a prefabrication station where we had a big pile of timber, which we measured by hand, and then we handed that into a container where we had 2 carpenters handling a circular saw, just prefabricating everything and sorting it out for us so that we could just pick up timber as we go, kind of building our own stock. And the foundations we built look like this in our detailed drawings. We have the screw pile on the bottom here, and that kind of bolts onto a metal plate. And a metal plate also goes on top of the foundation beam. And that means that we can make 2 bolts go on each side of the foundation beam, kind of clamping the metal down on the foundation beam. Which is a kind of long-winded solution, but it's all just to keep the timber inside the beam fully intact, so it can be reused once the structure is not in need anymore. And we can also see here the only exception to our own rule, which is the start of these columns when they attach to the steel foundations. We had to put a couple of bolts through each column just to keep it in place and keep up with regulation. But other than that, we've kept true to our concept. And here we also came to realization that how far you sometimes are as an architect from the actual build site. As this detail, of course, here in our drawing looks very neat, very simple, looks clean, there's no mud here. And as soon as we came on site and kind of got into these trenches, we realized it was very difficult to reach underneath them. We also keeping in mind that we built this in January, so it rained a lot, it snowed a couple of times, it was very cold, and our trenches filled up with water. So it was a lot of working underwater with your hands, trying to tie these columns together and make everything fit. And we became very aware. I think that's one of the biggest lessons we've taken from this project, is just how we should be considerate of what we put the builders through sometimes, because a build site might look very easy in a perfect Rhino model, but as once you're out there, it's quite a different thing. And this is also the point where we started to work out how to use these tensioners supplied by the steel strapping company. And they were very easy in the left-hand image, where we could prefabricate some of the foundation beams. But as soon as the building started to rise up, we had to use them on vertical surfaces, and sometimes in awkward angles, standing on a ladder, where it was very difficult to put your full strength behind the tool. And this became sort of a challenge all the time, that we had to cooperate and find creative solutions of how to use this kind of advanced tool. And as the tower erected further, we also came to realize that our idea of using the tower as a scaffold, it worked in itself as long as we worked from within the staircase. But a lot of the parts were very difficult to reach, especially when the structure became very tall. It became also a safety issue, because you can't really lean out from something at 8 meters height, trying to tie something down and do that in a safe manner. So in hindsight, we would have definitely used larger scaffolds, because these two small ones kind of required us to have to move them around, and sometimes we had to finish one corner before we moved on to the next one. All right, and now we're going to show you a time lapse of the build, and I'm going to hand over to Edmund as well.
Thanks, Ludvig. So yeah, the tower took a total of 3 weeks to build, including the foundations. Apologies for the timestamp on the video here. I didn't learn how to take it off until slightly into the process. But once we had the foundations in the right place, it was a case of securing the first elements of the column, making sure they were perfectly vertical and that the spacing was accurate, and that across the site the columns were in line with one another. That was the first time we could really tell that everything was going to be okay, since the foundations were made. The walls of the trenches stopped us from checking things across the site. So it was a big relief when we got up above ground level and discovered that our measuring had been accurate enough. You can see from the video that the weather was challenging, as Ludvig said. Lots of snow and rain and wind. And the site is quite exposed, given its location on the canal next to the big road. So we really experienced the elements coming through. But once the staircases started going in, we started making good progress, flying up with the structure. The elements that took the longest are the small details, sorting out the cross bracings, the strapping and stuff. As for laying in the walls, they could rattle up. So it was very satisfying on site, as you would often see big changes made in each day. Apologies for the poor quality of the video. As you can tell, the wind was really causing the camera to shake quite a lot. And as we approached the top deck, we finally managed to get the floor laid. And that brings us to the end of the video. Okay. Next slide, please, Ludvig.
Yes, I'm trying to work this out. There we go.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk to you about a few of the issues that we encountered on site. So as Ludvig mentioned, the trenches started to fill up with water, and this troubled our engineers, as we all know that if timber sits in water for too long, it can cause rotting. So the solution was devised to excavate the foundations again once the tower had been completed and build a false floor at the bottom, and then we could then drain the excess water into the adjacent canal. What's quite nice about this, though, is it does leave the foundations exposed now, both for inspections, but also so that you can see that circular connection with the ground, which is nice. Next slide, please, Ludvig. Now, our initial goal when kind of putting together the competition submission was that this would be a very simple structure. We would have limited number of components, and you would stack those components together to form the tower. However, once we started collaborating with the engineers, we realized that in order to make the tower viable and safe, the structure needed to become more complicated and more components were necessary. And eventually, once we got down to the building site, our 2,500 meters of timber, which go into the building, were divided into 79 different cut lengths, which, although we managed to sort out, you can see through these complex Excel spreadsheets, teaching that system to our volunteers became problematic. Although we did find that after 1 or 2 days on site, they picked up enough of the building system in order to delegate to their own teams of volunteers. So it did get there in the end. It just created slightly more of a gap between the architect and the layman constructor, which was of course pretty central to our ethos at the start. Next slide, please, Ludvig. Now, similar to the foundation detailing that Ludvig was talking about, our design processes in 3D modeling software gave us false notions of how simple the packaging straps would be to install. We discovered that in order for our building to meet the engineering specifications, there was a very strict order that all these components had to be installed in. And so in some cases, it became impossible for us to get strapping in the locations they needed to be. So we ended up having to drill holes through the timber and that sort of thing. However, we think that the resulting detail is really quite beautiful. It's a real product of the building materials and quite exciting to see. Next slide, please, Ludvig. So I'm now going to take you on a brief walk through the building. Now, we originally wanted to do this live from the building. I was going to broadcast via Zoom, but unfortunately the Wi-Fi signal is not very good, so we'll have to make do with some photographs. But just first, I wanted to show these 3 images, which were part of our initial concept sketches for our design submission. And as you might imagine, this is mine and Ludvig's first realized project where we've had creative control over the building from concept to completion. And it's very exciting to look at these 3 images now and compare them to the real building and see the similarities in the story that's come through by our own hand. Next slide, please, Ludvig. So from far, we can see the building against the landscape of the New Delft developments they're in so far, as the only timber structure that you can see in the area stands out against the landscape. Next slide, Ludvig. And as you approach closer, the form of the tower really comes into view. We recognize these 2 halves that Ludvig mentioned earlier, the open side and the closed side containing the staircases. Next slide, Ludvig. As you approach the mouth of the tower, this new timber floor, which has been installed by the engineers to resolve the water issue, not part of the original design, but really helps to draw you into the building. And next slide, Ludvig. As you step into the space, you see the full height of the tower stretch up above you. This is my favorite space in the building. You really get to see the full experience and understand how all the different elements come together. And our engineers informed us today that they're currently designing a chandelier to go in this space. Should be exciting to see. As you climb up the stairs, you get this very rich, different experience where the timber really surrounds you. It's very kind of warm and cozy feeling, and these slots offer light coming through in lots of different ways. Next slide, Ludvig. You also get an opportunity to get up close and personal with these details, these imperfect details, really experience how the building is being held together. This central column here, supporting the central stair wall, is working hard, not only to support the stair treads, but also to support the handrail instead. Next slide, Ludvig. And here we can see the profile of the stair treads, so you can see how those are held on. And also you can see the numbering system on the timber, which of course is how we identified pieces from one another on the site, so we knew what was going to go where. Next slide, please, Ludvig. As you look up through the building, these gaps in the timber are they're everywhere that you look, not only to let light through, but also to let rain through, so that there isn't moisture sitting on the timber for too long, and so that also if the timber needs to expand to reflect the natural humidity of its surroundings, then it can do. Next slide, Ludvig. And of course, finally, these slivers offer these really tasty little views onto the surrounding landscape, just kind of glimpsing at what's to come at the top of the tower. The staircase is split into 4 landings, each offering an opportunity to get close and personal with the cross bracing, but also a little window. Next slide, Ludvig. That looks back down into the structure itself, really emphasizing that inward nature. Next slide, Ludvig. And as you approach the top deck, the light pulls you up out of the dense timber structure. Next, Ludvig. And next. Until finally the user is rewarded with this 360 panoramic degree view of what will be New Delft, but is of course now a building site in development. Next slide, Ludvig. So just to finish off, we're very pleased with this building, very proud of the experience that we had. What we particularly like is that the building reflects the people that made it and the tools that made it. Next slide, Ludvig. The strapping isn't always perfectly vertical or perpendicular, and some of the timber looks a little bit wonky, and there's gaps here and there where miscuts were made. We had to pack things in, but as a process of the resources we had and the people we had, it's a really beautiful thing to see on the building, because it really immortalizes the time we had on site together in the building, which is really nice. Next slide, Ludvig. Yeah, so this is something we're very proud of. It was a remarkable learning experience for us, going through the process from initial concept, working with planners, working with engineers, right through to completing, and now doing the aftermath of the building as well. We hopefully learned that. We hope that others on the project learned something too. Next slide, Ludvig. And that's everything from us. Thank you very much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed our presentation and that you're able to come and see the tower for yourself sometime soon. We're hoping that with the pandemic restrictions easing, that one day soon the tower will be open for all of you.